Right now. Hi everyone, this is Rohrig from Climate Reality Europe. And we're just about to start the first webinar of our series. But before we do that, I would just like to shortly introduce you all to this initiative that we're kicking off right now, and also to our wonderful speakers that we have for today. My name is Gosha Rihlik. I'm a Communications and Strategy Manager for Climate Reality Europe. And today we will be talking about the one of the elements of our business climate action program. So as Climate Reality Europe, we are an organization of climate reality leaders, volunteers who are involved in climate action. Our role is to train them and then give them opportunities for education and leadership and taking leadership opportunities. And this today is one such opportunity. So as part of our business climate action program, we are trying to bring the new legislation in the EU closer to businesses, especially those that do not have the right resources or capacities to track the legislative changes. So we are trying to bring it closer to those who really need to know what's happening at the legislative level in the European Union, especially small and medium enterprises. So if you're one such organization, then this will be, we're hoping to be extremely useful for you. Today's webinar is organized in partnership with the Climate Action Network Europe. So we have some wonderful speakers joining us today. We will be talking about the state of climate action versus the Paris Agreement goals. We will go through the European Union's response to that. So what kind of climate law is being prepared right now, and what kind of legislation will help us achieve those ambitious EU goals. And then we are going to dive deeper into what is Fit for 55, a phrase that you might have heard, but usually we don't really get what's that. So we're trying to get to the bottom of what that is and what are the elements of this legislative package and how it will impact the business organizations. And then we're going to go through the planned support that the EU is aimed to provide, as well as the timelines. And at the end, we will have some time for questions from the audience. If you will need to ask any questions in the meantime, please type them in the chat and we will make sure to answer them during the webinar. So when it comes to our speakers, we have two speakers for today, Klaus Rohrig and Brigitta Bozso, if I read it correctly. So these are our policy experts from Climate Action Network Europe, who will be introducing all of you to the Fit for 55 package and broadly the climate law that the EU is working on. So without further ado, I will just give the floor to Klaus and Brigi. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Gosha, and also, welcome from my side. So my name is Klaus, as Gosha mentioned. I'm working as a climate policy coordinator for an organization called Climate Action Network Europe. We are based in Brussels, but we are a network-based organization with member organizations from across the European Union, but also from countries outside of the European Union. So we currently have, I think this is even an old number, we have more than 170 member organizations at this moment in our network and following mainly the EU's climate and energy legislation, but also kind of any kind of legislation that relates to financing and where we can kind of push also for the EU and European governments to take a stronger and more ambitious position in the fight against the climate crisis. And maybe just to say as well, I don't know if that is also, I don't know exactly the origin maybe of people participating, but we also have member organizations from the UK, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, the Western Balkans particularly, but also Turkey. So yeah, maybe just this as a very quick intro, and then myself and Brigi, we are working in the climate team, so we are following specifically the climate files of the Fit for 55 package in their current reform and revision, with me focusing on the emissions trading system and Brigi focusing on the effort sharing regulation. And I think, Gosha, you can go to the next slide. So we will dive right in, following a bit the agenda that Gosha already presented. So we will take a bit of a bird's eye view first, looking a bit into the actual state of climate action right now versus the Paris Agreement goals. So taking a bit of stock where we are at this very moment. So some of this might be already a bit repetitive, but we just wanted to, or you might be very familiar already with it, but I think it's quite important to set a bit the context also of the discussion of the actual policy response of the EU right now. So if we go to the next slides, we see, clearly the challenge that we as humanity are facing right now in terms of the exacerbating climate crisis. Of course, with the overall upshoot of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution mainly, and then the corresponding increase also of global mean temperature. And of course, as you know, that this is also the anchor objective, or the kind of key objective in the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, that kind of brought all countries together to find a solution and to stop this increase of global temperature rise. So we have the signed objective also of all parties to the Paris Agreement of limiting global temperature rise well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, so the more ambitious target of the Paris Agreement. And this is also for us as civil society organizations and as NGOs the mandate that we want to put the EU to account to make sure that also their policies are aligned with this more ambitious target of the Paris Agreement. And I think you are very familiar with the news, of course, and also with the latest scientific assessments that any kind of going beyond the 1.5 target would already put the world quite at risk. We already see very severe challenges across the world, of course, with the Pakistan floods very recently, already happening now, where we are in a world of only 1.1, 1.2 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So yeah, we are all very well aware of the urgency with which we have to act. Next slide, please. And of course, this is also just a reminder that the climate crisis itself, so the fight against rising global temperatures, is also only one piece of a larger package of crises, right? We are a bit in the era of the multi-crisis politics, multi-crisis world, and especially when we look at planetary boundaries or planetary stressors. We, of course, have several interconnections between the climate crisis and, for example, the biodiversity crisis, but also to ocean acidification. But we kind of see on many fronts at the moment that, humanity or our civilization is really pushing the boundaries and going maybe further than what is definitely sustainable. So also the fight against the climate crisis, of course, fits in this bigger picture of actually addressing also wider planetary crisis. So this is also where our network is coming in a bit more, linking up with these broader challenges. Here, just as I mentioned before, our mandate, we retrieve it from the Paris Agreement text, especially from the objective to make the EU's contribution to the Paris Agreement consistent with the 1.5 degree targets. Looking into the assessments that we've had recently, also from the IPCC, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is frequently addressing and assessing also the state of all governments' efforts and pledges and commitments. We see that, first of all, we are already well ahead on the path of global warming, so with a warming of around 1.1 degrees Celsius, and at the same time, global emissions are still continuing to rise. However, what we also see is that there are still pathways that can be identified that actually would make the world consistent with the 1.5 degree target. So the target is not lost. There is still space to keep this target attainable. But of course, this requires very rapid and also unprecedented action. And the IPCC usually highlights the targets for the world to halve CO2 emissions by 2030 and then reach net zero emissions by 2050. And of course, for rich economies and also regions such as the European Union that have also an historic responsibility to address the climate crisis, this means going beyond what the global average needs to achieve. So we are pushing for the EU also to take a leadership in the fight against climate change. And we just linked here also some policy implications. You will, I think, get also the slides after the call. So feel free to have a more detailed look at the numbers also of the carbon budgets that are still available. Yeah, thanks, Gosha. You can go to the next slide as well. Now really zooming in a bit more at the EU level. So saying that we actually still have some pathways attainable for the EU to follow in order to align itself with the 1.5 ambition. We, this week, actually on Monday, launched a report together with Climate Analytics that have looked at these pathways identified by the IPCC and the Sixth Assessment Report, and cross-checking it against the current actions undertaken by the EU. So here, first of all, we still see that it is possible to actually choose a path that is consistent with the 1.5 degree goal, but also seeing that kind of the top line headline targets that the EU is currently pursuing, both the 2030 climate targets, so the emission reductions until 2030, which is a reduction of net 55% compared to 1990 levels, but also the goal for the EU to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 can actually or should have to really be accelerated much more and actually brought forward in order to be consistent with the 1.5 levels. So the study identifies for 2030, for example, a target in the range 63 to 73%, which is also in line with the calls of NGOs that are calling for at least 65% emission reductions by 2030. And also the report shows or gives also evidence for feasibility of bringing forward the goal of reaching climate neutrality by a decade, so 2040 instead of 2050. But of course, those pathways would require us to move much quicker and to take much bolder action right now, especially for the short and medium term. So this is also then where the current EU negotiations on the revision of the climate and energy legislative framework comes into play. And maybe just one more sentence on this as well. The study also looked into the possible impacts of the so-called Repower EU Plan. This is an initiative by the European Commission in response to the war in Ukraine and also to address the need to accelerate the diversification of energy sources, but also, of course, the move towards a renewable energy system. And part of this plan was also the increase of energy targets, and you might have also followed the votes in the European Parliament last week. So only taking into account of if those higher energy targets would already come in place, we already see a slight increase of the also greenhouse gas emission ambition of the EU, but still it would not be enough to actually come into the range that the report identifies as consistent with 1.5. So even more action would be needed. And I think the next slides, it's just a bit of a reminder also, of course, of the context and the implications of failing or of hesitation or taking insufficient action. Evidence here is very clear. Also, data has become much better and more available of the climate impacts, usually translated into the economic losses for the EU. Every year, the JRC, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, also together with the European Environmental Agency, publish new figures and update figures on the economic losses across different member states and different regions in the EU. And we already saw that just between 1980 and 2020, we have this number for climate-related extremes causing economic losses of, nearly €500 billion in the EU. And of course, this is just the abstraction also of the experience that we all witness from the forest fires, the droughts, the floodings, not only in Europe, but of course across the world. So those are, of course, also numbers that we will see rising even further with higher frequency of these extreme weather events in case we do not take sufficient action. And I think on the next slide as well, we have also more and more insurers looking into the kind of cost of inaction, with usually a lead taken by Swiss Re, the insuring company. They have also estimated economic losses on a global level for different scenarios of warming, and seeing that with the current level of contributions and pledges to the Paris Agreement, where we are still failing very much behind of actually meeting even the 2-degree target, we would have we would face also GDP losses of around 14%. And of course, those are already quite conservative estimates. And I think now we will, exactly. Maybe there's any questions already, maybe on the context setting. Otherwise, we are moving now slowly towards the EU response, and I will give the word to Brigitta.
Yeah, sure. Searching for the unmute button, but found it. So, what's the EU response to avoid all these climate disasters and economic losses and lead us to a greener and fairer and stable economy? Well, it's the new Green Deal that was launched in 2019, December, coinciding with the global pandemic. What a memorable time to launch a new flagship initiative. Commissions like to have these flagship initiative. The first, it was a climate package and energy union. And for the von der Leyen Commission, this is the European Green Deal. And this is how it is put together. We will talk about these building blocks of this honeycomb image later. But the main thing to see here is that it consists of different directives and regulations targeting the climate area and energy area, and also some financing areas of the European legislation. So next slide, please. The objective of the European Green Deal is to transform the European economy into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive one, ensuring, first of all, that the greenhouse gas emissions are curbed and we are reaching climate neutrality by 2050, so mid-century, as enshrined in the EU climate law later as well. We want to decouple economic growth from the resource use. This is a hint to circular economy and very efficient use of our resources and energies. And we want to have it fairly, so no person and no place should be left behind. As the COVID pandemic hit our globe, the European Green Deal was also considered as a lifeline out of the pandemic. Build back better, build back more green. And so 1/3 of the investments, 1.8 trillion euros, are actually dedicated to the next generation EU recovery plan, and the EU 7-year budget will finance the European Green Deal. So the next slide, please. This will come as well with added benefits. So Ursula von der Leyen shaped this even as the third industrial revolution. So no less than a complete transformation of our society and of our economy, which brings not just economic benefits, but also fresh air, clean water, healthy soil, and positive impact on biodiversity protection. We will see more modern, renovated, energy-efficient buildings. We can eat more healthy and affordable food. The public transport's gonna be boosted more and probably more efficient, more clean, more available. Cleaner energy, cutting-edge technology, longer-lasting products, more and more future-proof jobs, no more hanging in there in the, for example, coal sector jobs that are deemed to cease in a short term as well, and to enter a globally competitive and resilient industry era. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? First of all, in terms of climate targets, the EU adopted a new nationally determined contribution, so-called NDC. This is basically the European contribution to the international climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. And Europe decided that by 2030, our climate target will be at least minus 55 net emission reductions compared to 1990. This was enshrined in the European climate law as well. So in order to implement this, we need to revise the climate and energy policy framework in the European Green Deal. And this revision of the climate energy framework is called Fit for 55 package, because we want to get to 55 by 2030. So on the next slide, you can see how it fits with the long-term targets. So by 2050, we would like to reach climate neutrality, meaning we will not emit more than what we are able to catch or sequestrate in forests or in any other way in the natural ecosystems. And for that, by 2030, it means that Europe wants to reduce its emissions by at least 55, as I said. It's important to know here that, as Klaus said at the beginning, we are not considering this is enough to reach to the Paris Agreement goal of climate neutrality and Europe's fair share in it. So environmental NGOs demand that Europe reaches at least 65% by 2030 to be also on a linear pathway to climate neutrality and avoid any delay of action, which will be more costly later. So I think here I will give the floor back to Klaus, who will tell you how this Fit for 55 package is put together.
Yeah, thanks, Brigi. I don't know if there are any immediate questions. Otherwise, I would, kind of follow up from this. So we're really zooming in a bit, right? So we had a bit the international level, the commitment in the Paris Agreement, the EU's promise also to provide pledges and commitments until 2030, but also for the long term. And then the policy response of the European Green Deal. And now zooming into the European Green Deal, we have this so-called Fit for 55 package that we will now talk about a bit more. And let's see what is this actually and what elements does it have. So this is really a bit of a summary. And overall, the Fit for 55 package is a set of different legislative proposals. So it's really meant as an EU initiative to, as the names say, make the EU's climate and energy policy framework ready or fit to implement the new NDC, so this minus 55% reduction target that the EU has submitted as a new NDC to the UNFCCC. So this package then consists of a number of different individual policy proposals that fall in different categories. And the Commission normally puts them largely in these 3 pillars, and then having this one that is now here under the support measures, but like one pillar would focus on the kind of pricing element. So you could imagine this is a bit the stick approach maybe on climate policy. So really strengthening the internalization of pollution in the price system, where I guess that you are familiar with the EU carbon markets, so where you have the EU emissions trading system as kind of the main instrument here that is covering nearly half of EU overall emissions, so mainly emissions coming from the heavy industry sector, but also from the power sector and also aviation. And here the EU has proposed one reform to strengthen the system, to bring the target of that system also in line with the new overall 55% target. At the same time, and this is actually part of this revision process of the EU ETS or of the EU's carbon market, is also an extension of carbon pricing to sectors that so far haven't had, at least not at EU level, a uniform carbon price. And those are the sectors that traditionally fall outside of the traditional ETS and have been part of the so-called effort sharing regulation. And here particularly 2 sectors were put in the focus of the Commission. So this is the maritime sector, so the shipping industry, that has been proposed to be integrated into the existing ETS, and then the establishment of a separate new emissions trading system to address fossil fuel combustion for road transport and in buildings. So this would be also heating and cooling in buildings mainly. And this proposal is also currently being discussed by the institutions. Then another element here in the pricing segment is also the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive, which is a directive that actually hasn't been revised in a very long time. The previous revision failed, I think, in 2013. And now there is a move to update this Energy Taxation Directive. So this would be concerning taxation of energy carriers in order to better reflect also environmental impacts of such fuels, for example, or energy carriers. And then another element which has also gained quite some attention, I think, in the discussion overall on the package, is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, or a border carbon tax, sometimes called like this. This has also been one of the kind of flagship priorities of the last EU Council presidency. The French presidency has really elevated this measure, and they have been also calling for such a measure for a longer time. So this is a mechanism that would put a price on important goods, specifically from also energy-intensive industries, so cement, aluminium, steel, to then be applied to imports coming into the European Union, also as a measure to protect domestic industry against products that are produced outside of the European Union with laxer environmental legislation or regulation. All of these are also currently still in discussions. Then we have a second pillar in the package, which is usually summarized by the targets setting. So there we have the effort sharing regulation, which basically deals with all emission reductions, with all emissions of the EU that are not covered by the EU carbon market at the moment. So this is mainly emissions from agriculture, but also transport, buildings, and waste. And here, this regulation sets nationally binding emission reduction targets for each member state to be achieved by 2030. And this is also now being updated and strengthened in line with the higher overall EU targets. Then we have an update of the so-called LULUCF regulation, or the land use change in forestry regulation, which deals more, rather with mitigation, it deals more with the removal of carbon dioxide, specifically in the land, peatland, wetlands, and forestry sectors. And also here, the revision foresees an actual target for the EU to increase the capacity of sequestrating carbon in those sectors. And then we have the energy legislation that also now are quite in the focus because of the energy crisis, and also because they have been again strengthened through the Repower EU plan. So the targets for under the Renewable Energies Directive, there's a target for 2030, which is binding to ensure that the EU has a specific share of renewable energies by 2030. And then we also have a separate process in the Energy Efficiency Directive, where we also set a target, which so far has been indicative, for increasing the efficiency in the energy sector. And then complementary to these two pillars, there's a last one that is under the rules top line or headline, where we have also the introduction or stringency of CO2 standards for cars and vans, where also the negotiations have already seen that the European Parliament, for example, is there also in favor of an earlier or a phase out of the internal combustion engine, the fossil-powered cars by 2035. And then we have kind of related legislation that concerns infrastructure and also fuels, both relating to the aviation sector and to the maritime sector. And then I think also in response to concerns, I mean, already before the war, of course, concerns on kind of an unequal or unfair burden sharing and kind of an impact of those measures specifically on low-income households. The European Commission also launched support measures, and particularly here one legislative proposal for a so-called social climate fund, which would be an additional fund that would be created in order to pool money specifically dedicated to support low-income households across the Union and also to fight off energy poverty. I think we can maybe go to the next slides. I mean, this is also just this is a bit of a shout out to ERCST, a think tank based in Brussels. They have made this overview, and I think it summarizes at least the process and the state of the current negotiations quite well. So you see all the different files on the left side, and then kind of the different stages that we are currently going through in order to arrive at the final outcome. So you have to know that this Fit for 55 package was launched last year in the summer. And then all of these individual files went through the kind of normal legislative process of decision-making. So it was launched by the Commission, and then it went to the European Parliament and to the Council, and then those institutions create their own position on the files, so they make amendments to them. And in the final phase, which we are actually entering right now, as most of the files have already gone through the process of the European Parliament and the Council agreeing on their own individual decision. Now in the final phase, this is the so-called Trilox phase that you can see here also on the right side in the last column. This is where the three institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, and the EU Council, come together informally to find compromises and agreements in order to achieve a final text. And that final text then becomes law. And at least on the kind of main climate files and also on the energy files, we are expecting, I mean, trilogues are now ongoing, and there is some pressure also on the EU to actually achieve some tangible outcomes before the end of the year. There was some pressure to have some outcomes already by COP27 in November, but it seems quite unlikely that on some of the issues, for example, the emissions trading system is is too complex to find agreement so quickly. But maybe there is a possibility of finalizing the trilogue by the end of this year, and that would also then mean that the files would then come into effect next year. Yeah, and then maybe just as a reminder again, that's on the next slides, that this package, of course, the Fit for 55 package, also is quite at the heart, but it's part of this whole honeycomb of the European Green Deal. So all these initiatives also fit or are supposed to fit a bit in this bigger puzzle that the EU has, or the European Commission has presented as their flagship initiative. And then maybe also just to mention again, we as NGOs, of course, are trying to ensure that this package is not only fit for 55, but we actually want this entire European Green Deal to be much more aligned with, or fit for 1.5, so much more aligned with also the more ambitious pledge under the Paris Agreement that the EU has committed to. And I think here I'm giving the word back to Brigitte.
Yes, so about the potential impact, I think there was a slide still for you on Gore, and
yes.
then I'll take over.
Exactly, now we're switching a bit, I think. So of course we were asked to talk a bit about the potential impacts, of course, knowing that first of all, as I mentioned before, the different legislations are still under negotiation. So we still don't know exactly what the final outcomes will be that will determine the exact impacts. But of course, we can give you a bit of an overview of some of the main elements of the Fit for 55 package here. But then, of course, as you know, also the negotiations are very heavily impacted by the fallout of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So here we actually have seen kind of different dynamics stemming both from the war itself, from the fact that the EU is still financing also the Russian war machine through the supply of Russian gas, of course, that is now dwindling or being reduced, but also the inflation and energy price crisis, of course, that have much more brought also the attention to the need for a just social reaction and social support measures. And here, very concretely, of course, we had the EU's reaction to quickly or accelerate also the achievement of energy sovereignty, and specifically the independence of Russian fossil fuels. There, we have a bit the headline of the insurance of energy security and energy supply, but also being a bit complemented by the so-called diversification of energy sources, where we also see different member states, but also the EU trying to seek alternative gas supplies other than coming from Russia. But of course, this is really a bit focused on the short to midterm. But from our side, of course, there's also a huge risk that even these short and midterm decisions might have as a consequence also a lock-in into further fossil fuel infrastructure. So we are also pushing on the EU to make sure that those decisions are still aligned and consistent with the long-term direction that we also see should be accelerated now, which is actually to achieve a fully renewable energy system and a complete weaning off of fossil fuels. And then very concretely, the Commission has come forward with the so-called Repower EU Plan. So this was an initiative presented in May, where notably the main elements are to further strengthen the energy proposals that they have presented last year in the Fit for 55 package. And this is an initiative to further kind of pull also on the ambition of those. So there was a suggestion to increase the renewable energies targets and the energy efficiency targets even further, but also to ease permitting, for example, for the deployment of renewable energies. But we also have to say that there are some elements that we see very critical. I mean, the increase, of course, of energy targets is something that we have been calling for a long time, but there are also elements of the Repower EU plan with quite potential risk associated. So, for example, there's also money being put aside to finance new fossil gas and oil infrastructure, but some of this money is supposed to come from EU climate policy that normally shouldn't be the source of such money. Then it's also questionable to actually look at the kind of magnitude of the funding. So we are kind of critically also observing where does the money come from, where should the money go to, what is really needed, and is there to make sure that there is no kind of alternative for a renewable based solution. So this is still ongoing, and this is kind of also moving into the negotiations that we currently have ongoing under the Fit for 55 package. I think here I will head back to Brigitte.
Yes. So what are some selected impacts? And by impacts, we selected some that might be relevant to the business sector mostly. So in the emissions trading system, we might see an increase of the EU carbon price, as this emission trading system is being extended, and also parallel system is going to be built up for new sectors like the transport and road transport and building sectors. This applies, of course, to big installations, mostly the traditional one, what we call also ETS1 system. So if you have a big incinerator or a big power plant, this is your area. Otherwise, this second ETS that's being proposed would apply for every kind of building and all of the road transport with a bit of delayed introduction. So it's unclear, the negotiations are ongoing when this would come into place, but definitely after the second half of this decade, so 2025, 2027, we might see also emission trading in these new sectors. Of course, it needs to be built up, and this is why also this so-called social climate fund is being suggested to help the most vulnerable and low-income households to be able to switch to more green solutions. More on the emission trading system in a bit. As well as the effort sharing regulation, we will go into a bit more details, but on the top line, we will see increased national emission reduction targets for the effort sharing sectors, which are agriculture, buildings, transport, and waste sectors. And this will put an increased pressure on member states to act and to create and impose policies and rules on businesses, for example, who are working in these sectors. Regarding the LULUCF regulation, as said, we have a higher target for carbon removals, and we can see a better accounting process, better reporting on how we deal with, how we manage our forests and how we protect our biodiversity and wetlands and peatlands. So on the next slide, I will focus on this so-called effort sharing regulation. This being said, this applies to member states, to countries, and gives a pathway how to get to this 2030 common European target. Every member state has a 2030 target as well, and they have annual emission allocations, how to reach the target. So each year a bit less they are allowed to emit. This piece of legislation covers roughly 60% of EU emissions, so a bit more than the emission trading system emissions. Yeah, we already told what sort of sectors are: transport, building, agriculture, small industries, and waste. And with the Fit for 55, we have an increased target in these sectors of minus 40% reductions by 2030. What might be interesting for you is that in order to implement the effort sharing regulation to reach these national targets, the countries will have to submit national energy and climate plans. These are the so-called NECPs. There was a previous round of NECPs that are in place right now, but they are obviously very outdated as they are corresponding to the old target, not this minus 40% reduction target. And the countries are going to have to submit their first drafts next summer, and the final plans in June 24. And each country has to undergo a stakeholder involvement process. So you as stakeholders will have to have a say on shaping in these plans, and you will have to be able to access the data on what your government is planning on the implementation, and you will have to be able to share your thoughts and concerns and priorities towards those plans. So normally ministries of energy or climate or development, whatever sort of ministry there is in place in a certain country, takes the lead in this process and informs the relevant stakeholder groups of these consultations. But we as NGOs will be also very active in it and try to consolidate voices and, of course, drive those NECBs to be fair and as ambitious as possible. So the next slide is about the ETS, the emission trading system. I will let Klaus explain because this is his expert area.
Thanks, Brigitta. Yeah, I will not go too much into depth here, but maybe this also just to flag why it's relevant, maybe also for you and for your business. This emissions trading system, as you know, well, as I said before, it covers the energy sector, but also heavy industry. So particularly from the big energy intensive sectors of steel, cement, aluminium, chemicals, and also the sectors of commercial aviation. And there is now, as I mentioned before, also the push to include the shipping sector and possibly also waste incineration into the ETS, if this is going forward. At least this is in the position of the European Parliament currently. Here, I mean, very in a nutshell, under the system, every ton of emission allowance or every ton of CO2 emissions has to be bought through the purchase of an allowance under the market. And then the overall number of allowances is determined and fixed. And then this overall number of allowances decreases over time. And this is how also the individual price of one allowance is generated through this kind of market approach with a long-term perspective of reductions over time. And here, I mean, what we see at the moment, and this is also where the scheme is particularly relevant, not only to those that are covered by the system directly, but it also, of course, influences the foreseen costs or internalization of pollution, also as reflected as part of the energy price. And here we have a big discussion going on at the moment, where normally the ETS would particularly penalize coal-powered energy, but due to the fact that also gas, which would be the substitute, is that we have such a high gas price, this mechanism at the moment is kind of not working as it should. So we have big discussions as well in the negotiations of the ETS, how to address this issue without undermining the ambition of the ETS, but with like to still give kind of a clear signal to incentivize also the deployment, particularly of renewables. Yeah, maybe that's, I think, enough to go into the ETS, and I think we can maybe move to the other bits.
Yes, so there's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which applies to iron, steel, cement, fertilizer, aluminium, and electricity generation imports, and it should equalize the costs for carbon with the goods produced in the EU and outside of the EU. And there's the Social Climate Fund that's proposed. This is supposed to be funded by ETS2 revenues. So as soon as the new emission trading system for road transport and building sector would be in place, those incomes would come partially to this Social Climate Fund and partially to member states' budget, and altogether, based on social climate plans, they would redistribute those revenues to those in need to facilitate their transition. There's the review of the Energy Taxation Directive. As we said before, this is long due because the directive is very outdated, and it would introduce new minimum tax rates for energy products like motor fuel, heating fuel, and electricity as well. And these are going to be based on real energy content and environmental performance, which is a big step forward from the previous practice. Next slide, please. There's also the Renewable Energy Directive review and the Energy Efficiency Directive review. These are all negotiated at the moment. Both of the targets in these directives will be increased. The renewable energy targets from 32% to possibly 45% share by 2030, and the efficiency target could be raised possibly to 14.5%. There's a quite heated discussion about the CO2 standards for cars and vans, and in there the phase out of the internal combustion engine by 2035. This probably will have a lot of impact on certain businesses, manufacturers throughout Europe. And I think this is the one of the five that draws a lot of attention, and you might have some more detailed discussions about that later in a separate webinar. There are some problematic issues in those bits of legislations that are being discussed now, and particularly those that are going against these green objectives and the whole objective of the European Green Deal and the green transition. And this is, for example, in the EU taxonomy, that labeling fossil gas and nuclear as green investment is really doesn't seem to be aligned. These fuels are clearly not sustainable in reality. And also in the Repower EU package, we see that in the name of diversification of the energy supply, they are including some investments into fossil projects, fossil gas and oil infrastructure, and waiver, so the kind of cancelling of the do no significant harm principle is very, very concerning. And also, it's very dangerous that they are planning to find financing and pulling some new money from the EU Carbon Market Stability Reserve. So these are carbon credits that would not be able to be used otherwise. And this is a very dangerous precedent that we would be able to emit more and take these credits out of the so-called cap. So we would sort of raise the amount of emissions that are allowed to be emitted in the name of repowering the EU. So on the next slide, Klaus will tell you some more about financial elements.
Thanks. Yeah, that's me again. This is also a bit the closure. So like the last elements that are, some of them are not directly related to the Fit for 55 package, but maybe to ongoing discussions, at least on the different financial aspects that are also kind of running in parallel, such as the Repower EU, but also other, for example, disclosure obligations that would maybe also be of interest to you, because they might also impact small and medium enterprises. So here we see currently also discussions about the, well, under the so-called CSRD regulation, or the non-financial reporting directive, towards tendency to increase stringency on disclosure obligations. So this would be obligations to disclose specifically environmental, social impacts of business activity, in order then, and particularly with the focus that we are seeing now on so-called critical sectors, where environmental impacts are considered relatively high. So here we see this move also specifically towards medium-sized enterprises in the sectors of agri-food, construction, waste, and energy. So this is still moving and ongoing. And then, as Brigitta mentioned as well, she mentioned the taxonomy regulation. Also here, we actually have this new push for this nomenclatura, for this declaration of investments. And also here, in order to ensure kind of consistency with those investments and activities, there is also then a disclosure obligation for the percentage of activities that would be falling under the label or the category of green, the new classification under this taxonomy regulation. Now, when we look a bit more into the kind of loan policies, specifically then loans that would be made available also for SMEs, we see a bit of a kind of guiding role here with the European Central Bank's supervisory policy on climate. And already here we saw some strengthening in the past, also related to the disclosure of climate-related risk. And also we would expect that rather sooner than later, that these also capital requirements will become also apply more and more to or being picked up also by other banks in the European sector, and therefore also apply to small and medium enterprises. So that there's also then a tendency for making it more difficult if a company's activities would be considered more expensive or more exposed to those climate risks. And then lastly, this relates then more to the actual EU funds that are being discussed at the moment as well, that are also impacted slightly by the Repower EU, but also still by the Next Generation EU and the kind of available funds, where we see InvestEU still as an important channel also for lending to small and medium enterprises. And here we have a target that is this mainstream target that we have had also in the discussions of the entire EU's overall multi-annual budget, which is this 30% target for all investments that have to be in line or kind of classified as climate-related investments. So far, this climate proofing, we would consider it being a relatively light touch, especially for investments that are below 10 million euro. But we also expect that in the negotiations coming up, especially for the next multi-annual financial framework, that those checks will be further strengthened and tightened. And here we also, this is a bit of a similar development that we also see within the European Investment Bank. And overall, we can say here that there is quite a huge scope also for SMEs to actually demand also at national level access to providing these finances and grants, especially for those kind of critical areas in efficiency, renewables, heating and cooling. And there we also, of course, have the channels under the so-called operational programs of the recovery and resilience plans that were also part of the Next Generation EU, and that are now also being tightened or influenced also by the Repower EU chapters. And I think here we will slowly come to an end. So this is maybe just a bit of a detailed timeline now, what's ahead. But this basically picks up again at this overview of where we are in the process. So we now have a lot of individual processes for each of the files to still be concluded. We have still discussions in the European Parliament and also the EU Council, and of course also still impacted by the more political discussions at the European Council level, so between heads of state and government, specifically on the energy market reform, but also the winter preparedness. But overall, we see that at least for the Fit for 55 files, that most of those files are now slowly coming to an end or entering really their final phase of these trilogues. So I think we will just end on this note of encouraging you to also join us and to fight with us and demand also increased climate action to keep also the pressure high. Just flagging here, of course, different initiatives also that are open to SME involvement or representing ambitious business perspectives. And many of those are also in a coalition that we call the Coalition for Higher Ambition, which brings together, for example, the corporate leaders group, the climate group, institutional investors, investor group for climate change, and different initiatives that we cooperate with on a regular basis. So in case you're interested, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to connect you to our respective colleagues. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. So as we're running out of time, sadly, we will close it for now, but feel free to reach out to us via the email address shared on the screen. We will be happy to answer your questions and also create educational materials based on this webinar. So be on the lookout for communication materials from our side. We would like to make it clear for SMEs, but also broader speaking, the business sector, of what's to come from the EU when it comes to legislation, and how can we support business organizations in the decision making based on how the legislative landscape will be formed by the EU. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.